Hi, everyone. Okay, great. I think that we'll get started. So really great to have all of you with us today. My name is Karina Vold, and I'm an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. And I'm also an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. And for those of you who maybe are not familiar with the Center for the Future of Intelligence, we're an interdisciplinary research center, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust. And all of our research focuses on a broad range of questions about the nature and impacts of artificial intelligence on society. So today I'm really excited to be joined by my two colleagues. So first I'll introduce both of them, and we're joined by Dr. John Zerilli, who's a research fellow at the Center for the Future of Intelligence. John is a philosopher with special interests in cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and law. And John originally trained to be a lawyer and also worked as a barrister in Sydney for a brief period before turning full-time to philosophy. He's also the lead author of a new book called A Citizen's Guide to Artificial Intelligence, published through MIT Press. And this evening, we're going to discuss some of the issues raised in it. And I also want to introduce our other panelist, Dr. Jonnie Penn, a #1 New York Times bestselling author, historian, technologist, and activist. And he's also an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. So we do have a few questions prepared to guide our discussion for the next hour, but we're also really keen to get questions from the audience. So if any of you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A box, and we're going to turn to those towards the second half of the hour. Now, I also want to mention that captioning is available for those who need it. So hopefully you guys can find that feature if you do want or need that. And I just wanted to start us off, I thought, by asking you, John, to just say a little bit about this book that you wrote, maybe who you wrote it for, and what you hope readers will take away from it.
Thank you, Karina. The purpose of the book is really to provide an entry-level sort of guide to the average layperson that wants to know what all the fuss is about with AI. So for about the past, say, 7 years, AI is having a bit of a, I suppose you might call it a renaissance. And the renaissance is being spearheaded by research in a particular branch of AI known as machine learning. And a lot of what we've heard about in the media, about the wonderful technological breakthroughs that are occurring in the area of AI really boiled down to the use of machine learning and a specific form of machine learning known as deep learning. And so a lot's happening in the area. We learn that it's having impact on a great variety of areas of our lives, whether it's our workplaces, whether it's how we interact with our governments, how we shop online, how we enter into contracts. There's so much going on, and it all seems to come back down to this particular breakthrough in the technology. But the technology poses a lot of issues that affect us as citizens. We might be affected in any number of capacities, but it's in our capacity as citizens of democratic states that I'm particularly interested in. And I thought that it would be good to give the average punter out there an accessible guide into this area that is captivating attention. And the point of the book, I should just say one thing about the authorship. It's a little bit unusual, the authorship, because actually what you've got is my name sort of leading the panel of authors, and then you've got these other authors that are contributors. So members of the audience might be familiar with this thing called the edited volume. So academics love producing edited collections of things, which is where they get a panel of experts from a range of different disciplines to contribute their musings on some aspect of a field, and then they get it bound up and published in a book. They have their value for certain, but they tend to be difficult to read. You end up with a kind of a miscellany of jarring styles where you can't really just pick up the book and read it from start to finish as a seamless whole. So we didn't want that. So the thought was that I would write about half of this book to set the tone, and then get my contributors to give me their contributions, which I would then take over and, with their permission, massage so that it could jibe with the style that I had set in the half that I had written. And the hope is that this way it reads with a single voice and has a single arc. So you can read it from start to finish, rather than a dense, sort of complicated technical book, which would be very difficult to read in that way. So that's the idea, that's the motivation for the book.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it had a great final product insofar as it having that single voice throughout. So one thing I was really struck by in reading this book was how it really was written for citizens and as an attempt to inform citizens. I assume so that they can exercise their voting rights in the best ways. And I'm curious if, after having written this book, if you have sort of suggestions or what you left feeling like were the right kinds of changes that a citizen should be advocating for, since we hear of different possibilities like data ownership, breaking up conglomerates, regulatory agencies. What do you think is sort of the main thing we should be looking for as citizens?
Yeah, the aim here is to give citizens the kind of step change in their awareness so that they're brought up to speed with, I suppose, the basics that would then enable them to exercise their right to vote intelligently. I often draw a comparison here with climate change and global warming. Not everybody knows about the intricacies of climate change and geology and meteorology and oceanography and so forth, but you don't need to have that detailed knowledge. You just need to have some sense of what's going on, why it's important, and then that activates a kind of move for popular struggle and demanding changes on governments, so that governments know there's a constituency out there that won't just take inaction on climate, sitting down. They are going to essentially push back if governments aren't towing the line on climate. So the idea with this book is to give as many people as possible that sort of step change in their understanding of the digital world that will enable them to take it as seriously as climate change. I mean, climate change is obviously an existential risk, but the digital world that is transforming right now, we are undergoing the transformation right now, promises to change our environment, our political environment, our civil society, our structures, no less potentially profoundly, albeit in another way, than the change in our climate. So there's an imperative there to get people up to speed. As for what we can do to get people, what people can do, so I'm thinking here about, yes, you mentioned breaking up the big ones. So the big tech companies. That's something that's mooted here and there, but I don't know if people have thought about how that might go. There are precedents in history for taking industries that are sort of taking over the space, monopolizing, which have monopolizing tendencies. There are precedents for governments going in there and breaking off aspects of those companies and putting them under sort of private administration, separate administration, so that not one entity gets to control this huge apparatus. I think it would be good to get a conversation, a kind of groundswell there to take this more seriously. I feel that people, like the general public, is a little frightened maybe of what they stand to lose if they go down this path, because everybody appreciates their Twitter account and their Gmail account and all the things that come for free, and they're probably worried about the repercussions of that happening, of these things being somehow compromised if they take a stand. So an example of that would be in Australia itself, where the government in Australia, for its own partly petty reasons, its own political reasons, has gone out and has made sure that Google and Facebook are forced to bargain with media companies in the Australian media landscape for a fair, on fair terms, so that media outlets in Australia are not being producing news content essentially for free, so that Google and Facebook can then divert all the traffic from them. And whether that's right or wrong, whether that particular approach is right or wrong, it's not really what I'm so interested in on this point. I'm interested in whether it can be done, whether a government can stand up to Google and Facebook, get the backlash, which the Australian government did. Facebook actually turned off its media pages for, I'm not sure, I think it was like 24 or 48 hours for a period there last couple of months ago. And that really sent shockwaves through Australia. People were not able to access the sites that they were accessing for their news. They were no longer able to access. And that showed the power of that company in flexing its muscle. But I think if there's enough concerted effort, and it's a global movement, in the same way that global warming, climate change is a global phenomenon, a global movement, then that groundswell, I think, will count for something and can change the way these companies are dealt with. So and this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but essentially I'm hoping that with greater awareness, there will be more informed citizen engagement, including marches on the street if necessary. It's as important as that.
And just to be clear too, so it sounds like part of what you really want to inform citizens on is the harms that are not just the potential harms, but the harms that are taking place now. So the trade-offs that they're actually making, so that sort of the recognition that we may lose something in the future will come sort of with an awareness that we've lost something now, or that there's a kind of trade-off in their benefit. Is that kind of the goal there, John?
Yeah. I mean, the harms such as they are, we don't quite know what the harms are yet. We know that there's potential for harm, and we know that there may have been harm already. So the familiar case is the US election in 2016. It's alleged that election was decided on the back of very few votes that might have not materialized had it not been for a certain advertising campaign by Facebook. So we don't know if it actually happened, but the very potential for it to happen, the fact that there is a company that could exert this kind of influence and could change the outcome of elections is enough to make us worried, or should be enough to make us worried.
Yeah, I agree. And as you say, we've seen historically that there is precedence, whether it's steel, oil, tobacco, or even what's happened, I think, in the 80s with companies like, mobile companies like AT&T that did get split up. So it does seem like there's a possibility for that happening. Are there other changes that you think are worth pursuing, either as politicians or as citizens? So if we talk about things like a regulatory agency that could operate either at a national level or at an international level, for example, or potentially expanding our human rights in some way to guarantee better protections?
Yeah, so I'm very much into kind of taking meaningful baby steps. So the international sphere is one that we will eventually get to, but I think we just have to start with the basics first. And the low-hanging fruit is the regulation of the companies that have some kind of presence in your jurisdiction. So for example, I believe Facebook and Twitter are incorporated presently in Delaware, I believe it is. So that automatically implicates the Delaware government to do something there. That's a matter of corporate law. So that's where things should begin. Because Facebook and, just to take Facebook as one example, because Facebook has a presence in Australia, the Australian government was able to do something there. So we've got to start small. As for what else could be done. There's a lot that can be done in data protection law and privacy law. So there are currently principles that we've inherited. They may be 30 or 40 years old, and they are in need of revision. So we all know that the EU, through its general data protection regulation, has certainly made strident efforts towards promulgating a clearest, well, they're not terribly clear, but certainly a more rigorous set of standards to which companies should be held when they deal in data belonging to other people. But a lot of jurisdictions haven't had those efforts, haven't made those efforts. And even in the case of the GDPR, there are many outstanding questions about how we should be regulating the use of data. So for example, you can give consent. So traditionally in privacy law, there was a principle known as purpose limitation. So you could only use data for named and specific purposes. But you can't give consent. You can't give informed consent to the use of data if there isn't a named and specific purpose. And the purposes that are often used on digital platforms are very vague. They're not named specific purposes. So if you take something like Facebook's clause, the bargain there is, if you allow us to mine your likes and your shares and so forth and your comments, we'll give you access to the site, which will help us improve our product and services. Something like that. So that boils down to, if you let us have your data, we'll implement Facebook. I mean, that's not a named and specific purpose. So you can't give informed consent. So it looks like there's consent, but it's not an informed consent, because you don't really know what that data will be used for, except for this very vague sort of thing. Questions about what you can consent to. Questions also about how we treat the products of data analytics. So companies will take your data, but they won't just keep it there. They'll do things with it. They'll run it through an algorithm and infer things about you. So there are questions about whether your consent to the use of data for a particular purpose extends to the data that is inferred about the data you've given, as opposed to the primary data itself. GDPR doesn't really answer those questions. So there are a lot of other outstanding issues in data protection law that need to be clarified. And I mean, this is not really something for citizens so much as for politicians to attend to.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I wondered about, just following up on that final point you made there, if there are sort of no well-informed political candidates advocating for the right kinds of changes, is it as much a problem as educating the citizens as it is educating politicians about sort of what can be done? Or do you think that sort of groundswelling should come from an informed citizenry, as you've mentioned?
I think it's both. And the book, I mean, everybody is a citizen. Even politicians are citizens. I should say, obviously, there are stateless people, which is another issue. But in their capacity as citizens or in their capacity as politicians, the book is there for both. I mean, it's there for anyone who wants to raise the pitch of discussion around these particular issues facing us.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to invite Jonnie, if I may, as well, to hear your perspective, and both of your perspectives, on another sort of model that sometimes gets talked about, which is data ownership. And I, for one, have some doubts about this model, but I'd like to hear what both of you think.
Do you want me to go first? John, I defer to you because you have legal expertise and I don't. I'm a historian. So I can only say that, ownership as a mechanism historically to redistribute power is pretty ineffective. And I think rights, as a non-lawyer, seems more promising. And not just individual rights, because we live in a hyper-individual world these days, but collective rights, because these statistical tools seem to impose on us in collective ways that need pushing back on. But John, you're the lawyer, and you've literally written the book. So I'd be curious to know what you would say.
Karina, can I clarify? Is your question whether we should treat data as a form of property? Is that what the question is?
Sorry, yeah, the question is that so one model that I've heard floated is that we should treat data as property, and that citizens should have the right to sell their data, let's say, to Google, so
Right.
or to these different companies, and that this would be a way of empowering citizens, let's say. And I think there are reasons to be skeptical of that model. Of course, I think some people can therefore afford privacy, and other people couldn't afford privacy. But there might be, virtues to this too that are worth talking through. So
Yeah. So the idea of data as property, it's one of those funny things. You can, there are these little puzzles in philosophy where you can say something like the round square, but it doesn't actually exist, but you can say it. You can say the round square. It's just a non-entity. Data as property is something that can be said, and it even can be conceived. But when you interrogate it a little further, it immediately crumbles. The one thing about data, especially in a world in which data is commodified and used as a resource to draw inferences, the one thing about data in this sort of world is that it robs data of personality. There's no such thing as personal data in a sense, because what you give up when you give up your data is actually data about anyone that's remotely like you, because your data is taken, but it is of no unique interest in and of itself. Your data only has power to the extent that it can be aggregated with somebody else's data. And then that's mixed up, churned through, and then you get a result at the end of it which tells you something like, people that have such and such characteristics tend to be like this or like that. That's not, so by giving up your data, what you're doing is giving up data that essentially pertains to everybody else that's like you, everybody else that fits a certain pattern of behavior. There are other examples too. So if you give something that you think is very personal to you, something like your DNA, your genetic information, again, that's not personal, because that's something that you share with anybody that is your kindred. So your children, your parents, your grandchildren. You're giving away this data because you think it's yours, but actually it's not just yours. So the idea of data as property is problematic, because in this day and age, you cannot give data away that just stops with you. The buck doesn't stop with you; it spreads out. So yeah, I think that sort of makes the point. Okay. Property generally is something that attaches to you, that you can surrender, that you can trade away, that you can buy back, and it doesn't affect anybody else. But information about you isn't like that. It's inherently unstable as a resource. It doesn't just mean what it means for you, it means what it means for anybody that has your characteristics and your traits. And we're all alike and unalike in an infinite variety of ways. So you're bound to implicate other people when you give up your personal data.
Can I comment on that, John? Because one of the questions I had for you was, you end the book talking about COVID and how, you guys as authors, like everyone else, didn't see the pandemic coming and the politics that was going to bring, and reflecting on what that meant for AI. I'm curious to know now what we in the audience should take from the book, given not only the pandemic, but also the Black Lives Matter movement, given that, certain citizens face oppression that other citizens don't. Black communities may be more subject to surveillance in the United States than white. I'm just curious what the kind of, how those two recent kind of global events have changed your reflections on the sort of subjects you talk about in the book.
So so what are the two events? How Black Lives Matter, or
Black Lives Matter, yeah, and also the pandemic.
Right, how that's changed the thinking about
Yeah,
these.
or just emphasize different arguments that you made in the book, and or change your thinking on the book.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that the book picks up on in the chapter on bias is the differential impact that algorithms have on different demographics. So, I mean, we've all heard of this before, that the industry, the machine learning industry, is populated for the most part by white males, and the assumptions, the presuppositions of white males is what you tend to get in the artifacts that are produced. So unsurprisingly, these systems work best on people who have certain characteristics that we associate with white males. So they perform less well on women. So, for example, a classifier would have trouble distinguishing faces of, say, let's say Asian women. It would perform better on white women. The same classifier might have a higher accuracy in distinguishing between the faces of males, white males, as compared with white females. So you can sort of go through all the different categories, all the different demographics, and the technology doesn't seem to perform as well as it does on white males. So white males are kind of like the thing it works best on, and then you sort of go down from there. What the pandemic has highlighted, so to begin with Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter is really just a movement that reinforces the underlying background conditions of discrimination and structural racism that exist in our societies in the West. So that's one way in which my thinking has changed, is that it's suggested to me, Black Lives Matter has suggested to me that the things that we talk about in the book are actually very apropos, and they're on track. The pandemic has made me wonder about if I could put it this way, the stickiness of surveillance technology. Once you roll out a system of surveillance, ostensibly for good reasons, for good public reasons, such as monitoring the spread of a pandemic, of a virus, when the threat recedes, the threat which originally motivated this apparatus, when that threat recedes, we're left with the surveillance apparatus. And I worry that it won't be as easy to roll back, because these things tend to be sticky. I think it's often called surveillance creep. And I'm not entirely sanguine about our governments and their use of these surveillance technologies for purposes that are proportionate and that are adequately adapted to the ends which they are meant to serve. So that's a form of skepticism that I always had, and that I had ever since 9/11, and 9/11 saw a spate of legislative changes that were also basically kept in situ well past the threat being removed. But I mean, it's too early to say in the case of the pandemic just what use will be made of these methods of surveillance. I mean, they're not sold as methods of surveillance, they're sold as public health care measures, but it's too early to say. I'm a little skeptical, and I worry about surveillance creep.
Maybe following up in a somewhat related question here. In your chapter on privacy, you distinguish between 4 different kinds, and you focus mainly on informational privacy.
Yeah.
And I noticed that in the chapter on autonomy, you have this discussion about whether or not autonomy is intrinsically valuable, or really if it's primarily valuable for extrinsic reasons. I've often raised that question with privacy. So I wonder if you think informational privacy is intrinsically valuable, or if you think its primary importance comes instrumentally. So for example, for how it can protect our autonomy or self-development.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't given it too much thought, actually. I suspect that it's both intrinsically valuable and instrumentally valuable. And the reason I suspect that it's intrinsically valuable is that the information that pertains to us, our personal information, doesn't just seem to be something tacked on to us. It seems to be very much germane to who we are as people. So who I love, how I relate to others, what my proclivities are, what foods I like, what sort of music I like. You're describing me. So I mean, it's for that not to be abused, for that information not to be abused, seems to be not just something that would be useful for some other end. It seems to be intrinsically useful, sort of intrinsically important. It goes to who I am as a person and my right not to be violated, or my dignity as a human being not to be violated. That's my initial sort of suspicion. I haven't given too much thought on that. I don't know what yeah, sorry, Jonnie.
John, just before I understand we might be turning to community questions in a sec, but I wanted to squeeze in, if I could, a quick question about, one thing that really comes through in the book is, as you've alluded to already, the significance of many of these decisions as citizens that we need to make about our informational future. And I was curious if you could just say a bit about moral skilling, reskilling, and de-skilling, because that seems probably at the kitchen table, like the idea of moral skilling or de-skilling doesn't seem obvious. So I wondered if you could introduce it and say why this concept's important to think about the future of AI from your perspective.
Yeah. So a point that Shannon Valor made in my discussion with her last week on philosophy cafe culture is that technology has always been transforming us. Technology has always been exerting an effect or an influence on us. It's a little bit like the spider's web. You can't really think of the spider without the web. It's just a natural extension of what the spider is. And in the same way, ever since we started using stone technology and then converted to bronze and then went through the Iron Age and so on, our technology has formed part of what we are and how we relate to the world. So it's not surprising that AI would have an effect on us as well as another form of technology. This is Karina's area of expertise, and I know she would have a lot to say about this. But there seems to be something potentially unique about the way that AI will affect us. And in broad brush strokes, it's something like the effect that AI will have on our moral selves, on our beings as moral agents. I'm not suggesting that previous iterations of technology have not had an effect on us as moral beings. I don't want to suggest that. In fact, I brought up an example with Shannon Valor last week about how even methods of criminal enforcement and criminal detection, the way that penal systems have evolved through time, different measures of surveillance and technology to find criminals and to locate them and to prove that they were culpable of crimes. Those technologies have exerted an effect on how severely and brutally we punish people. In the medieval period, when the methods of enforcement and detection were quite primitive, you couldn't let a criminal just escape lightly with a rap over the knuckles. This is the theory that comes from Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish. You had to use really severe, brutal punishments like quartering and hanging and beheadings and so on, because you had to make a real example of that person. Otherwise, people would just weigh up the chance of being caught, think, I'm not going to be caught anyway, so I may as well commit the crime. But if they know that if they get caught, they're going to be treated in this abominable way, they'll think twice about committing a crime. Now that we basically, in this day and age, if you commit a crime, you will be found. So the methods of punishment can be much more humane. So technology has been exerting an effect on us as moral beings. It's affected our moral sensibilities for some time. But with AI, I think the question that's unique with AI is that as these technologies take over more and more moral decision making, so we defer to them to make decisions that traditionally would be made by humans using their moral faculties. The question is whether we will become less practiced in moral decision making and whether our skills will degrade. So there's a question about whether it's a specific way in which our moral beings may be altered by our use of AI. In this case, potentially a negative effect, which means that we're less able to exercise our moral reasoning faculty. I'm not saying that this is going to happen. It could actually go the other way. It might be that because if we give AIs all the low-level, low-hanging moral work to do, we can be freed up to exercise our moral faculties in ever higher domains. Maybe we can look after more of our loved ones, we can spend more time with them. And so it's not a bygone conclusion, a foregone conclusion that we will lose our moral skills, but it's a question worth considering. So that's the thought there about moral skilling and moral de-skilling.
Thank you.
I think I'll turn to some audience questions now, if that sounds appropriate. Okay.
Yep.
So our first one is from Irene, and she's asking, what are your thoughts of AI being used for emotional recognition? And she's given an example. She says, like 4 Little Trees in Hong Kong that claims to assess the emotions of children in an educational situation, which I guess is an example of maybe a story in Hong Kong, I'm not sure. And then her final question is, do you think that AI at the present time is actually sophisticated enough to do this? So I guess to engage in sophisticated emotional recognition.
Well, just so that I'm not the only one talking, I mean, we've got some fantastic experts here. So do either of you have any thoughts about this, about the affective effect of technology on us?
Karina, I defer to you.
I mean, I can give my answer, but I'm just wondering whether...
I don't have any well-developed thoughts. I mean, so I think the second question that Irene asked is, how well do you think AI can do this? And I think I'm skeptical about how well at present AI can do that. And there are some headlines about facial recognition, for example, detecting emotions. But I think this kind of maybe gets to John's really nice Clever Hans example, where, is it actually picking up what we think it's picking up, or is it sort of giving us the right answers for the wrong reasons in some cases? Which maybe this is a chance for you to talk about that nice example if you want, John.
Yeah, so there's a lovely story about this horse in Berlin, close to the beginning of the 20th century. And the horse was named Clever Hans. And he was named Clever Hans because apparently there was nothing he couldn't calculate. If you gave him a sum, he would be able to tap out the answer with his hooves. So if you told him what's 5 + 7, he'd tap out slowly until he hit 12, and then he'd stop. He could apparently understand sentences in the German language. He could understand so arithmetic. He could do multiplication. He could do division. It wasn't just addition and subtraction. And obviously it generated a real stir. And he made headlines in New York, and the New York Times had this headline, I think it was Berlin's wonderful horse. He can do almost anything but talk, was the headline. But then a psychologist came along and investigated the case of Clever Hans, and the excitement was, it seems in the end, misplaced. It's not that Hans was actually able to calculate the sums that he was given or give appropriate responses, generally yes, no, sort of binary responses to questions he was asked in German. He wasn't actually processing them. He didn't know what he was doing. But what he was doing was reading his owner. So apparently the owner was always in view of the horse. And when the owner, when the answer was, the correct answer was approaching, so that the correct number of taps was approaching, the owner's tension would peak. And then at the second last tap before the correct response, the owner's tension would then ease after that. And at that point, clever Hans knew, okay, I've only got to tap one more time and that'll give me the right answer. So if the answer to the question is 5, he would tap 4 times. On the 4th tap, his owner's tension would be at its height, but then it would immediately ease. And then he knew, oh, okay, I only have to tap one more time and the answer's 5. And the moral of the story is you can have systems that apparently do intelligent things, but they might be doing them in, well, let's just say, I don't want to say unintelligent ways, because that already is quite a feat for a horse to do, but doing them in ways where the reasoning will be, will go awry under the right circumstances. Maybe simple cases, it's good enough, but in a more complex case, this is not the way to go about answering a question. It's a bit like doing a multiple choice quiz where you just say, I'm going to circle A for every answer, but that might get you by. You might get 8 out of 10, but the next time you'll get caught out, and answering A to every answer will give you maybe 3 out of 10. So in the context here about emotion, it's almost certain. I mean, of course, the systems are not reading our emotions in the same way that we are. We are evolved organisms. We have a faculty for mind reading, or reading the social cues of others, and we can interpret one another's behaviors in a way that is connected deeply to our evolution. These systems don't have that history, so they're doing it in some way, but it's not really anything like the way we do it. As for the question, what was part of the question, whether this is problematic, whether it's safe for this to happen? I'm just trying to find the question to get.
I think the question was just what are your thoughts about it, and
Yeah.
then whether or not you think it's sophisticated at present time to do this.
Yeah, like you, Karina, I don't think there's anything at the moment that convinces me that our emotions can be read in anything other than highly stereotyped and sort of very context specific situations. But I mean, I think that the technology will improve a lot, and I think it can have some very beneficial uses for people with suffering from the effects of loneliness, various mental illnesses. I mean, just put it this way, if you're having a bad day, sometimes all you need is maybe a little Twitter alert or an email to pop into your inbox. And that might just make the difference between you feeling a little bit glum and just having a little bit of a pickup. So it doesn't surprise me that if there's an artifact, okay, it's dead on the inside and it doesn't have any sort of interior life, fine. It doesn't surprise me though that an artifact that says the right things at the right time, in fact, that let's just say that's really hard to distinguish from something that does have genuine affect, genuine emotion, it doesn't surprise me that would have that same kick-up effect in your well-being. So I'm hopeful that it might have applications in mental health.
Can I ask a follow-on question to that ties into some of the questions that the audience is asking, John?
Yeah.
Karina, is that all right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I was going to turn to some, so you might have the same ones on mind. Go ahead.
Well, so Kate Crawford's new book will be out soon, and the opening pages talk about Clever Hans. And one of the things Kate argues is, what is missed in this story when it's retold is that there was this actually quite remarkable relationship, as you just described, between the horse and this human, even if it was different than it was perceived. And what I'm seeing in the chat from people in the community is, how do we separate kind of, or how do we work with AI as this distraction? That things that, in my mind, I separate it between AI and the AI revolution. The AI revolution is just kind of everything else that's kind of distortion and manipulation to capitalize on the sort of visions that AI gives the public, the kind of emotional cachet that the public has. The question for you is, how do you separate between kind of meaningful AI that's going to influence our future? And I know you do this in the book, but for people that are new to this field, how do you draw the line between those areas?
I think the opening lines of the opening couple of pages of the prologue to the book talks about how difficult it is to determine whether we really have crossed a Rubicon or not. And that it's almost impossible at any moment in time to determine whether this is the next big thing that's going to change everything, or whether it's just another thing that will dissolve in the ebb and flow of time and be forgotten. And I gave examples, for example, that H.G. Wells, who was a technologist extraordinaire and whose visions of the future were astounding in many respects. He wrote a book that was later made into a film called Things to Come. And yet even someone as astute and perspicacious as H.G. Wells thought that submarines wouldn't amount to anything, and yet they're indispensable in naval operations to this day. So this is just all a fancy way of me saying, I don't know. I don't know if there's a way to tell. You kind of do need the perspective of the historian here to tell you what, to maybe to draw parallels with technologies that have come before, that have stood the test of time and that have justified the fanfare that they've generated. But I don't have a neat, simple little trial by error or heuristic to determine the answer to that question.
Thank you for your humility.
For my non-answer. That's my non-answer.
No. We need more humility. But Karina, I'll let you. I'll go back to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump to another question here so we can try to get through some more audience questions. So Steve asks, my question links to Leverhulme CFI's Trust in Society work stream. And he says, Bryson, 2018 says that trust should be reserved for human relationships and not AI. Do you agree? How can politicians build citizens' trust in AI?
We use the word trust rather loosely. We refer to trust when we talk about, obviously, ourselves, our conspecifics, other human beings, and it makes most sense in that context. But we often do use the word, perhaps ill-advisedly, when we're referring to pieces of technology. So, for example, if I get onto a flight, I get onto a plane, I board a plane, I trust, there's a sense in which I could say I trust the autopilot will do its job and it will be safely carried in the air. But is it really trusting the autopilot, or do I trust the humans who created it, the systems put in place by the humans to ensure that there's been rigorous stress testing and all of that by Boeing? I think it's the latter. It's not really that we trust a piece of kit. What we're trusting is the human and the human agency involved in it. The other thing to say about trust is, in the social psychology literature, trust goes with something like a sense of reliability, that the subject of the trust is reliable, that can do the job. But there's also another emotional, affective component, which is often just described in the word warmth. Now, we can have warmth towards a conspecific, towards a fellow human, but we can't really feel warm and fuzzy about a piece of technology. So it's like technologies can certainly have certain elements of trust to them, but they don't seem to have all the necessary conditions for genuine trust. As for the second part of the question, which is how can we make them more trustworthy? Was that the question?
It was about whether or not politicians, or how politicians can go about helping to build citizens' trust in AI.
Yeah, well, I think the proper question is, how do we build trustworthy AI? And then we can worry about how to build trust in AI. But the technologies themselves need to earn our trust. And again, it's not so much the technology, it's the people behind them. So what governments need to do is see to the human foibles that are currently in the mix, make sure that they are hemmed in and regulated so that the excesses, the worst excesses of capitalism and human avarice and greed are kept in check. Do what we have to do, break up companies, reform data protection law, get human rights in order, make sure the technologies are rigorously evaluated by a public body. I think you mentioned this before in one of your early questions, and I missed that, by some sort of public agency that vets these machines, publicly releases the evaluations, makes sure that the evaluations of the technologies are constantly conducted and released to the public. And then once you've got that sort of system in place, then we can say that the technologies and the technologists behind the technologies are worthy of trust, and then the public can be brought in on board. But it seems to me the question is asking the later question. I think there's a prior question, which is about how do we make the systems and the people behind the systems trustworthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think maybe that is a way of answering the question too. So if the question is how can politicians build citizens' trust, something a politician can do is maybe advocate for a regulating agency or something that manages that oversight process that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that might be in turn a way of getting.
And it's also one of the things that people in tech worry about is giving up their proprietary algorithms and releasing them to the public and to competitors. But if there's an agency that is responsible for this, there need be no fear that that will happen. The agency there'll be commercial in confidence. It'll be all kept secret, but at least we know that a public regulator has gone in there and has vetted the algorithm. They don't have to release the details, but they do have to release something to confirm that it's passed, the test. Just like with pharmaceuticals, we have in North America, you have the FDA, and pharmaceuticals are regulated in a special way, and medicines go through clinical trials and certain phases, and all of that is meant to produce an item that is safe to sell to the public.
And one that the public can have some trust in because it's gone through the process.
Yes.
I completely agree. And that, just to mention, Anna had a question in the chat, which I think this touched on really nicely. So Anna, I'm gonna skip your question because I think that John has done a really good job of addressing that. Another question from the chat that I'll raise now, John, and I guess we're just coming to the last few minutes here, so this might actually be one of our last questions, but I think it's a good one because it touched on something that we haven't touched on in your book, which is that you have this great chapter about how AI is being used by governments, or not just sort of how to govern AI, but how governments are actually using AI. Right. And so the question is, what should citizens be more aware about? The use of AI by corporations or by governments?
They're both riddled with potential for harm, so they both come with risk. Just given the nature of governments that are democratically elected, and the procedures that ensure that discretion that is conferred onto public officials and bureaucrats is legitimate, I personally have more faith in governments using the technologies for good than I do private companies. However, the risk, as I said, the risk for harm is present in both contexts. I'm answering personally, I think we should be more worried about it in the private sector than in the public sector, but both have the problem. It's probably easier to regulate the public sector than the private sector. So there's obviously fear about stifling innovation in the private sector. Well, you don't really have that so much in the public sector. So perhaps we can, I suppose, have a beta version or some sort of prototype system for regulation that we adopt in the public sector first. So maybe instead of going to a full-scale regulator that vets algorithms from scratch, perhaps we should just start by having one that vets algorithms that are used in the public sector first, and then use that to pivot off to create something more specific to the private sector. Yes, that's... Am I getting everything in that question? Have I missed something in that question?
I think you've done a good job of answering it. Yeah, it's a broad question. So we do probably have time for one more. So this comes from Maddie in the chat. And the question is, in what ways do you think policymaking will need to evolve in order to keep up with the dynamic technological developments that we're currently seeing?
Oh, that's a very broad question. In what way will policy need to evolve to keep up? So my question here is, what do we mean by policy? So in what ways, I mean, that in a sense, that's like another way of asking the question, how do we solve this problem? Like it
Yeah,
seems very broad.
sorry, maybe a way of narrowing it.
Yeah.
The way I was thinking about this is just given how much AI in particular is changing. So I guess I was reading that a little bit like the question of the definition question of what do we mean by AI, and given it's changing so quickly, how do we go about regulating this?
Okay, so this is more like a definitional question. Okay. Yeah, so some technologies are going to be, so on one definition of AI, a calculator counts as AI. But most people don't think of a calculator as AI, and probably for good reason. But, you know, on one definition, it is AI. So would it be caught within a piece of legislation that is there to regulate a technology that's defined very broadly as AI? Potentially. So that would never happen. My suspicion is that you would never have regulators that would define the target of regulation in such a broad way. So what I think will happen is it's going to be a little bit of playing catch up. The very best legislation gets amended like constantly. It's just constantly amended. If you look at a legislative history, it's like, 50, 60 amendments, even tiny amendments over several years or more even. So in this case, I think what will happen is we'll define a technology as it stands at the moment. And so we'll regulate that particular technology, whether it's a classifier, whether it's a certain form of machine learning, whether it's deep neural networks. We'll define it as it is at the time at which the legislation is passed. But it might be that within 6 months, the legislation will need to be amended again. It'll just be a game of constant playing catch up. This is not unusual. It's not just in areas affecting technology, but just even in other areas where the fast pace of change means that you constantly need to update your legislation. So I think that's what will happen. It's going to be a messy area. It's not going to be a clean area. Some of the old laws on, so for example, the law on partnerships, so firms that operate as partnerships, not as corporations. The old legislation for that in England, I think it was the late 19th century, that stood the test of time in the sense that it wasn't amended really at all, something like 30 or 40 years. Corporations law, by contrast, is constantly amended. So I think this is going to be one of those areas where we're just dealing with messiness all round.
I think that's a really helpful answer to that question, actually, John. I wasn't aware of that. So that's interesting to know. We're just coming to the very end here, and I wanted to just give you an opportunity, John, if we have a minute or two left, to maybe say if there's sort of one data point or one example that you came across in writing this book that really stood out to you as sort of a reason why a citizen should care and should want to be more informed if they're not already convinced to do so.
Yeah, so the example is now an infamous one. It's the one of the system created by, I believe it was Microsoft, called TAI. And TAI was meant to learn how to speak and contribute to discussions on Twitter. And the only input was the input to train TAI was human speech, human interaction, human tweets, essentially. And within the space of, I think, 24 hours, TAI was spurting the most outrageous, vilifying, egregious things that you could imagine. Things about Jews, things about Black people, just really unmentionable, disgusting stuff. So if you don't think that this subject is enough to elicit your sympathies or your interest, just consider if a system like TAI was used in any other context that was involved in making a decision affecting you. And that's not far-fetched. It's not far-fetched to think that an AI system is affecting you somehow, even if it's just applying for a loan, or it's getting credit checked for something that you're buying that requires credit, buying a phone, for instance, even a mobile phone. Just think of how that would affect you or someone that you care about if the technology were not regulated and that Tay were allowed to be a commonplace. It's frightening to think. So that's an example that stood out for me.
That's a really great one. Thank you, John. I would encourage everyone who's interested to pick up the book. You're in very capable hands. That's how I felt as a reader of this. When the authors really know their stuff and are walking you through that in a way that's really accessible and helpful. So thank you to both John and Jonnie for this conversation. And thank you all for joining us today and for your questions. And I want to say thank you as well to the Leverhulme Trust for funding our center's research too.
Excellent. Thank you both for joining me. And thanks to the audience for tuning in.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.